Honorable Leader of Opposition Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I do support relief of any kind to St. Lucians, especially persons who are in the lower quintile of our population, or the two lowest quintile of our population. Madam President, the VAT for burial support is one that is very sensitive when persons listen to it. And of course, one would ask, why would the government consider VAT? Is it because they're concerned about persons not being able to bury their loved one? I did ask a funeral parlor in terms of the range, the cost associated with burial. And Madam President, I was told that it ranged from $2,000 all the way to $50,000. I was surprised that some people spend large amount on burials. And I asked, and there may be a few persons who would do these things. Madam President, we have VAT as a means of collecting revenue, as it were, at this point in time. And whereas the government intends to remove VAT, I would imagine that the government would be very judicious in terms of not having this whole fiscal position of the government collapse, because the government is trying to satisfy what was in a Fight to Stay Alive manifesto. Madam President, I'm also aware that the government, through social services, are also contributing towards burying persons who are unable to bury their loved ones, their family. So there is support at the Ministry of Social Transformation, and that budget used to be significant back in my time. The St. Lucia Social Development Fund also was assisting families. I know that our support in social programs have been, diminished significantly. So there are some persons under this arrangement who would be receiving support, and I dare say they may and therefore they might be able, but there are some people who are doing it who would welcome the support. So I have no problem with this, but again, motive must be investigated here, because I do not see the magnitude of the benefit, recognizing a lot of poor persons who are unable to bury their loved ones are still going to the government, who is actually paying for the burial at modest $1,400 thereabout. The area of service connection, again, if you are getting reconnected for a service that you've lost, no VAT. But the distress fund, Madam President, the distress fund was being used when I know I was running at the St. Lucia Social Development Fund to avoid persons for being disconnected. In fact, there were a number of interventions in a number of communities where persons were indebted to the service providers, where we intervened to prevent them from losing those critical services, especially water for their homes. I find it's rather strange that the government would get rid of the distress fund that prevented persons from being disconnected, but remove VAT on reconnection. On reconnection. And the final area which is a matter of interest, Madam President. I understand the logistics of removing VAT on contracting services. But in this one, it is a specific contractor. It is not a general, it's not for all contractors. So as it's obtained right now, all contractors certainly who within the threshold of having the turnover over $200,000 would be VATable and would have to go through the process of paying VAT. But this specific contractor, the government have decided to make their environment VATless. In other words, they're not contributing to VAT, and that exemption, I take it, that they will go to the suppliers, and the suppliers would pay for the materials and not, of course, pay VAT on those materials. And of course, my honorable senator, they would concur with me on that in terms of the process. So you have a VAT exempt certificate as a contracting firm. You go to Home Depot to buy materials, you would issue that certificate, and Home Depot not supposed to charge you VAT. I ask why. Is it because the government trying to remove the transaction cost of taking the money from them? What is the benefit of doing this? A large contracting firm. Madam President, I listened to presentations made on the lower house in terms of the tendering process. I know how most bills of quantities are prepared, and where VAT is allocated in the bills of quantities is usually on the summary page. After you do all your totals, you come up with the total cost of the project, and then you put your VAT at the bottom. So the price can be seen in a bill of quantities if you tender in, the VAT price and the price without VAT. If we're going to approach large projects in this environment, this a specific large project, I think a lot more should be said about that specific arrangement, because it's not general. It is not for all contractors. It is not open up to the entire environment where there's all contractors are now operating in a VAT-free environment. So I would have wished for more information should be given as to why the government decide to have this arrangement and have and see it necessary for this. The other two, Madam President, in terms of reconnection, I dare say, had we maintained the distress fund, probably you would see less persons having to, the government could have intervened to ensure that households that are critical retain their connection, because the pressures are on sometimes, and persons find themselves not being able to pay their water connection. Madam President, there have been times where in an entire community, small community, government have had to intervene to assist them, not just one person, through the distress fund. I know this for a fact. So therefore, Madam President, I'm asking, what is the rationale for this? Because certainly the burial, I understand, but can you imagine, Madam President, if you were burying somebody for 3,500 persons, the VAT is what, $525? You get that off. You know, I understand that. But we really need to look at carefully the issue of other persons who may be burying somebody at $50,000 who can lavishly. Shouldn't that person pay their sales tax, as it were? Because the VAT becomes another form of sales tax. Shouldn't that person, in that kind of service environment, be paying VAT? You know? And so that is my main concern with that motion is concerned. Thank you very much, Madam President.